Okay, welcome to the launch of a new book, Functional Coexistence in Socio-Political Conflict, Enabling Social Change Across Decades. My name is Tatsushi Arai. I go by Tats. I am a graduate of the PhD program, 2005, currently Associate Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at Kent State University's School of Peace and Conflict Studies. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge people who are calling in, and I see you in a very compact shape in front of me, but I'm seeing the global presence of people calling in from across time zones. I would like to just welcome out the director of the Carter School to say a few words to get the meeting event started.
It's not an improvisation. I didn't know that I'm going to ask to say a few words, but I'm more than delighted to say a few words. And so, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, I think the book that we are launching today is going to be quite impactful because I've been asked to co-write the foreword for the book. And I had the opportunity to read before you've done. And started. Congratulations, Tats, Margarita, really great work. And this book, coming from two peace studies, primary peace studies schools here in the US, is just fantastic. It's just a collaboration between us. But I think in terms of content, the functional coexistence, the area that it explores is very important. And around peace and the negative peace, positive peace, the whole debate. This book has a message and does a great job. So Margarita and Tats, as editors, actually edited the book, but it really reads like authored book, which is often not the case. As we know, with the edited volumes, every author has their own voice. And that's not really the best way of focusing on a particular subject. But I think you two have done a great job with that. And the second one is the subject matter, and I know that this work has been in progress for a long time, and you worked on it really hard. You brought amazing list of scholars to look into the subject from different perspectives. And as a Carter School, having the opportunity of support it for open access, it was my delight to really do that. So, Margarita, Tats, congratulations, well done. And let's start with the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Functional coexistence is a pragmatic relationship of mutual denial, or at least mutual non-recognition, sustained for decades in the absence of direct physical violence. And before I get into why we began to pay attention to this idea, I would like to recognize that this is a collective work done by a group of 9 scholar practitioners, all of whom are interested in both rigorous research, and the practice of peace building. So that practical aspect coupled with scholarship did enrich the project. But it so happens that I actually started this conversation back in 2007 to 2009 when I, as an NGO representative, was doing a training in Palestine, meeting with the Hamas leaders, the youth wing members, the Israeli settlement leaders, and so on and so forth. I was still very new to Palestine. One of the biggest questions that came to my mind on the beach of Tel Aviv one day was, is it possible to think of existential conflict, meaning mutual non-recognition, mutual denial, as a factor in a peace process, perhaps more broadly peace building? Or if you consider that as a factor, would peace building actually disintegrate? I was relatively fresh from a PhD. I learned, for example, from Chris, my professor, and other people about existential nature of the conflict, but I have not experienced a systematic look into that question. But subsequently, I spent 5 years during the civil war of Syria, training Syrian government, civil society, and humanitarian professionals, mainly in Lebanon, sometimes in Ankara. It is those training experiences that finally convinced me that I should really formalize this theory. And before I go further, I'd like to really acknowledge the people who contributed to this program. First of all, Alp, thank you so much for warmly encouraging the project, co-authoring the forward. Professor Susan Allen, whose really initiative was essential for getting the project started. I confess I'm not the one who initiated it. It was Susan, and then Anne, who is also in this room, who will be presenting later, together with Margarita, who kindly proposed this. My dear academic mentor, Kevin Aberg, was so kind to review the early version of my journal article published in 2022 that first articulated functional coexistence. Rich Rubenstein, late Johan Galton, whose work on structural conflict was absolutely essential in systematically conceptualizing the structure underpinning of functional coexistence. Jill Helsing, who gave us guidance, later authored a chapter. Roger McGinty, Sunyon Lee, Doga Eralp for writing case study chapters. Doga was supposed to be with us, but he had a health concern, so he's sharing regrets. And then my dear Professor Chris Mitchell, who endorsed the book. And I pledged to Chris that I would try to get B+ from him today. So I have to behave myself quite well. The funding to make this book open access was provided principally from McConnell Foundation in Redding, California, then supplemented by Kent State University's School of Peace and Conflict Studies, the Carter School, as well as its Center for Peacemaking Practice. Margarita, Susan, thank you very much. And we are going to just begin the presentation, but I'm going to just share with you the lineup for today's presentation. First, I'm going to talk about the theory of functional coexistence and its implications for conflict intervention and peace building. And followed by me is going to be Professor Guger, lecturer at American University's Washington Semester Program and of the Carter School. And her presentation is titled Functional Coexistence in Cyprus, Negotiating the Seemingly Non-Negotiable Limits of Mutually Acceptable Actions Across the Intercommunal Divide. Then we have another case study by Professor Margarita Tadevosyan, research assistant professor and the executive director of the Carter School at the Center for Peacemaking Practice at Carter School. We have Professor Mohammed Abnimeh, professor at the School of International Service at American University, and Abdul Aziz Said Endowed Chair in International Peace and Conflict Resolution at American University, presenting on coexistence and dominance, Arab-Jewish relations in Israel. And finally, Dr. Anne Phillips, a fellow at the Carter School Center for Peacemaking Practice. Her presentation is titled A New Approach to the Armenian-Azerbaijan Conflict, Prospects for Functional Coexistence. Now, let me just proceed rather systematically about my portion of the presentation, which is to more systematically introduce the idea of functional coexistence. Our main message, however, is please read the book. Just read the book. Okay. The field has invested for the past decades in a well-known thesis, how to see common ground for conflict resolution. The leading scholars and the junior scholar myself invested so much in finding common ground between adversaries. There has been an emergence of a new thread of thinking that is to explore how to stay constructively engaged in an enduring state of conflict non-resolution. And to illustrate this idea, I'm going to just take a decade I spent in Rakhine State, western part of Myanmar, as well as in other parts of Myanmar, showing the IDP camps. One is a Rohingya camp. The other is the Rakhine community. They are also displaced. The Buddhist majority, some Christians, and then the traditional belief, holders of traditional belief as well. If you go to each one of these communities, especially the camps of the people displaced, how do you see potential common ground between the two sides? They say no. Do not even mention common ground. The kind of discourse I keep hearing from Syrians during the Civil War when I was leading the training. In other words, if people like myself try to see common ground and proceed with either dialogues or workshops, even training, on that basis, there is a visceral response to reject common ground, let alone reconciliation, let alone conflict transformation, peace building as potential starting point. And to address this challenge, refusal to consider resolution, transformation, let alone reconciliation as a starting point, we're going to quote Bernard Mayer. And to do that, I'm showing the picture of deep roots. And he says, enduring conflict is that aspect of a dispute that is embedded in structures, systems, or identity, will therefore not be resolved through short-term resolution-oriented conflict interventions. Enduring conflict is long-lasting because of its nature, not because of ineffective or inappropriate efforts to resolve it. Until the roots of the conflict change, the system evolves, or the identity of value-based elements are profoundly transformed, conflict will remain, although how it is manifested may vary over time. This kind of thinking has been in existence. Chris is one of the prominent authors of intractable conflict theory. There's also a lot of work on productive conflict. So the idea itself is not that you accept for the emphasis that unless the underlying systems change, resolution can be elusive. Now, I'm going to just use this body of literature as a point of departure to rather systematically formulate what we mean by functional coexistence. Functional coexistence is a paradoxical social space whereby there is an enduring negative peace, the absence of direct physical violence. And on the other hand, you have a state of mutual denial and mutual non-recognition. Now, we claim that functional coexistence is applicable from interpersonal level all the way to the global level. But at the national and international level, what exactly is denied or non-recognized? We are talking about statehood, the regime, signature policy like one China policy, or even social identity of the whole category of people. The list can go on, but what I'm referring to is a rather serious systematic something that makes the existence of an entity very difficult, if not impossible. Now, if you think of sustained negative peace, something is sustained, then denial, intuitively, those two do not come together. But hold for a moment. There are so many contexts I have seen as a practitioner and as a scholar. These two come together, and this coming together creates a blind spot for the field we are arguing. Succinctly put, functional coexistence, as I said, is a pragmatic relationship of mutual denial or non-recognition, sustained for decades in the absence of direct physical violence. Now, let's just put this theory into some practical context and expand the imagination about the social context in which functional coexistence either presently exists or is potentially relevant. The word potential is emphasized here. We are mentioning Taiwan, Strait and mainland China, East and West German relations. These are the two case studies I used in my original formulation in 2022. North, South Korea, as well as the United States, Afghan Taliban Washington relations, Rohingya Rakhine Burma, Sinhalese Tamil Muslim in Sri Lanka. So the italicized context are the ones in which I have some hands-on experience. Is that potentially is that Palestine in the future? Potentially is that Iran? And this is a big potential. Russia, Ukraine, and NATO. I keep emphasizing potential because if ever there is going to be a sustained ceasefire, there is not going to be a compassionate embrace that follows. It will be a very pragmatic, sadly, a cold coexistence of sort that global society will struggle to uphold. And we have to do something within that space. So functional coexistence may play some role. That's the meaning of potential. To the extent that we are proposing decades, meaning at least a generation of time frame as a scope, talking about 20 to 30 years. Why? Because that's, as I alluded to, is a time frame which generational change happens. If certain conflict stays for a generation, there's going to be a succession planning. The regimes can change. The narratives are passed on. So this time scale of 20 to 30 years is a rather deliberate choice we made. The question is, what exactly happens in terms of inter-party relations within that time scale of a generation? The field has used terms like stalemate, stuck, changelessness. But the closer look at any of the contexts actually reveals an incredibly dynamic changes that are happening in what outsiders may casually say stuck. I'm introducing the concept of shifting boundaries of mutual non-recognition using 20 years of the work I have done in cross-strait relations, Taiwan and China. Here, I am presenting this XY dimension just to simplify. On the x-axis, you see the range between more collective, more individual. More collective simply means that the action or interaction is more group-based. On that y-axis, I'm showing a range between more informal and formal. Formal means more institutionalized, organized relationship. More informal means the opposite. That's closer to the origin. And if you take these two dimensions, the relationship can go anywhere. Yeah, so it's not an asymmetrical extension here. But essentially, the work I have been doing in cross-strait relations is called straight talk. We have been occupying a space like this. It's not so informal, not so formal, because it's not a government-to-government negotiation at all. It's not too collective, but not too individual either. And in this space, what I am actually drawing here is the perceived limit of mutually acceptable conflict behavior. Because there is quote-unquote existential conflict, the parties see this is a boundary that you cannot cross. Beyond this, any kind of elastic interaction, any communication, it's not going to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, if you look at cross relations for the last 80 years, you see how dramatically those non-negotiable boundaries shifted. To illustrate, in 1992, the two sides came up with a loosely contested view of one China, with Beijing asserting that Taipei basically accepted some interpretation of one China that was good enough for the two sides to start technical discussions starting in Singapore in 1993. That in turn became the basis over time for a de facto free trade agreement, 2010. Then the cross-strait summit took place in 2015. As of 2025, cross-strait relations is a very dangerous, precarious situation. I'm not depicting any rosy picture here, but my basic conceptual point states that elastic boundaries of non-recognition are in fact negotiable. If you take a decades-long view of elastic boundaries of non-recognition, meaning that we reject the static image of stuckness and see quote unquote peace potential in dynamism over decades, what kind of proactive thinking comes out? To me, the field hasn't explored this sort of very tenacious pragmatism. So we are entering the formulation of an approach, which we call the functional coexistence approach to conflict intervention. Here, I want to make it very clear that functional coexistence is an empirical descriptive concept, the description of what exists. Functional coexistence approach is a descriptive, normative, action-oriented concept that understands elastic boundaries of non-recognition and frame that as a basis to wage constructive peace building in a way that's pragmatic. We are offering 4 guideposts in this journey of purposeful action. And to do that, we are showing the context. This is the John Paul Lederach pyramid juxtaposing different societies. It can be 3, it can be 4. Within a regional context, a global context, emphasizing a layered nature of the activities for functional coexistence approach. The first guidepost we offer for functional coexistence approach is to develop parties' historical consciousness of the shifting boundaries of mutually acceptable conflict behavior, which I illustrated using time demonstration. If you become aware, you become a little more pragmatic. It's not nothing that you can do. Second, find a constructive way of staying engaged in the enduring state of conflict non-resolution. Don't give up. Be strategic. Find an entry point. We have much more to say in the book, but I'm going to just stop here. Act on the multi-layered structural view of conflict intervention while resisting inertia of hegemonic stability and submissive inaction. This is a very important point. Functional coexistence is never accepting domination of one party against the other. In order for functional coexistence to come into being, we are asserting that agency of so-called low power party is a must, meaning the ability for the party to make decisions and act on them. If the agency is removed, meaning colonialism, apartheid, and imperialism, we are basically going back to the orthodoxy of peace and conflict, that is, say, wage nonviolent action, civil disobedience. That is no longer the space for functional coexistence. Functional coexistence can never be used to justify a systematic subjugation of colonialism here. So please be careful of this one. But be aware of the multi-layered nature. It's not just party A versus B. There is a vertical structure. And finally, make use of the short-term actions to foster enduring enabling conditions for long-term systemic change. Now, these two points are a little important. So I'm going to just illustrate this. Now I'm wearing my practitioner hat on. If you're in functional coexistence context, what exactly is the view through which you do practice, either training or dialogue or whatever it is? Usually, in the context of functional coexistence, all you can do is very short, practical, hands-on actions or projects. You cannot envision a 30-year plan or something usually. But can you plan those short-term actions in such a strategic way to increase the chances that some sort of a step, a process, or patterns toward transformation become more possible? While you shouldn't be disappointed, even if that connection doesn't get made. It's okay. Make that course. That's why I kept saying enabling conditions is not the outcome. But as I said, this short-term, long-term strategic connection is always in that structure context. Remember the Cartesian space I showed you. So you have to wage that in a deeper structural understanding here. Now, this is a theory, and now we go to practical illustrations. Our book has several case studies, And three types of case studies, to be precise. The first type is enduring functional coexistence, which has over 20 to 30 years of negative peace plus non-recognition or denial. Case studies from Cambodia, Cyprus, who is going to present on this one, Northern Ireland, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo. And those, we argue, more or less illustrate what we refer to as functional coexistence in different versions. But we also introduce a little bit of creative addition, that is transitional context of coexistence, which means at least 10 years of negative peace plus signs of non-recognition or denial. In other words, this is not exactly a context of functional coexistence, but there are signs emerging. If there are signs emerging, is there any way we can start thinking about functional coexistence approach to peace building there? Then the final category is the most audacious, ambitious one that is done by the two of the senior colleagues of mine. Potential emergence of functional coexistence, ongoing context of non-resolution and non-recognition in which functional coexistence is potentially useful as a way forward. They can be bad, these can be violent. They are not functional coexistence examples. But if the contexts are so severe, perhaps analogies from functional coexistence could be applicable. One example is Arab-Jewish relations in Israel. Mohammed is going to present on that. And then Armenia-Azerbaijan relations by Anne. So this is a menu, and this is a setup of our presentations. Sophisticated way.
So I can just say thank you to Carter School for hosting the event, to our editors for this opportunity, and it's great to be with Mohammed here. We are both the alumni of the school, so it's great to be back. And you know, as someone from a high context culture, you know, I usually have a hard time to finish my talk on time. I can see my students are saying yes. So I brought them because just in case if my speech is too boring, they are the only ones who are going to applaud, you know, right? You say yes? Okay, awesome. So they're from American University. I have a student from Mason also. Can you raise your hand too? Okay, he's gone, so he already understood that. Okay, great. So thank you so much for everyone for being here. So what I'm going to do now is based on the great overview of the theory of functional coexistence that Tatsushi actually made. I'm not going to, you know, use my time to talk about functional coexistence again, but I'm going to try to implement how this theory works in the Cypriot context. You know, as Tatsushi also said, it's a enduring functional coexistence case. And, you know, as many of you know, Cyprus is considered as a frozen conflict. There are decades of peace efforts and international interventions and bicommunal activities have prevented renewed violence, but have not resulted in a comprehensive solution. So this research actually examines this unique phenomenon, how Cypriots live within this paradox of negative peace and unresolved conflict while striving for cooperation in their everyday life. So at the core of the concept of functional coexistence, as you already listened, there is this relationship about a state actually where communities in conflict do not fully reconcile, but maintain stable and working relationships that prevent violence. In Cyprus, there are some conditions actually enabled functional coexistence in Cyprus. So one of the major precondition is the existence of external actors, of course, in the island. So we have united peacekeeping forces, we have Turkish troops, we have military bases of Britain, and deep distrust between Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots has been ongoing. This is preventing full reconciliation, but also avoiding renewed warfare. And there are bicommunal initiatives and intercommunal exchanges at every level, actually. And I know in this room, we have a lot of colleagues who engaged in track 2, 1.5 initiatives before. Chris is there, one of the pioneers about that in Cyprus case. And there are a lot of bicommunal activities ongoing in Cyprus between the two sides of the communities. This reality means that while Cypriots interact daily through work, trade, education, cultural events, fundamental lack of trust and recognition still defining the conflict. So just a very brief history. I know history can take hours, but very brief history for the ones who doesn't know much about Cypriot context. Cyprus, the island's geopolitical significance made it a site for competing nationalism. Greek Cypriots largely sought enosis, which is union with Greece, while Turkish Cypriots supported Taksim, which is the partition of the island, while the island actually was fighting against colonial rule of Britain. So after the fight against the colonial rule, Republic of Cyprus was established in 1960 with both Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots, but constitutional disputes and power struggles quickly led to intercommunal violence. So as you know, it continued until 1974, and Greek-backed military coup and the Turkey's military intervention in the island solidified the division that we have right now that continues actually more than 5 decades. Since that time, Cyprus has remained divided between internationally recognized Republic of Cyprus, as you know, in the south, and self-declared Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus in the north. Despite actually many peace efforts until today, lots of confidence building measures implemented also, and we also have unplanned referendum in 2004 that also failed. Cyprus still remains politically divided. However, Cypriots continue to engage with each other in informal ways and creating the state of functional coexistence. So you may ask, like, what are the conditions actually really, what are those contested forms of intercommunal interaction that makes it functional coexistence? So one of the central aspects of functional coexistence in Cyprus is the paradoxical relationship between the two communities. While majority Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots continue to view each other as a threat, they still refrain from direct violence, which actually creates the delicate balance between the two sides, and this creates state of negative peace. Their interaction still continues across the spectrum of recognition, because there is a spectrum of recognition at different levels. There are different forms of recognition, ranging from outright denial and non-recognition to passive acceptance and cooperation. At the most adversarial end of the spectrum, nationalist factions within each community reject the legitimacy of the other. Many Greek Cypriots still view the North as occupied territory since 1974 and refusing to acknowledge the political or social standing of Turkish Cypriots. Meanwhile, Turkish Cypriots recall their displacement and experiences in enclaves between 63 and 74. This shapes a deeply entrenched sense of historical trauma for both communities. These conflicting narratives mean that each side recognizes its own suffering, but often denies or minimizes the suffering of the other. Despite this official stand of non-recognition, the reality on the ground is more nuanced. Bicommunal technical committees is just an example to you, but there are many other bicommunal activities at all levels between the two sides. But technical committees, for instance, have been operating since 2008, allowing experts from both sides to collaborate on practical issues such as environmental protection, cultural heritage restorations, health initiatives, and many more. However, political sensitivities often limit their effectiveness. Right now, for instance, majority of the technical committees are not working fully functioning. The Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus presents a unique case of acquiescence where it's not officially recognized as a state, but functions as one in daily life with institutions, elections, and working economy. Over time, some Greek Cypriots and international actors have passively accepted its existence, even if they don't officially endorse its political status. This state of engagement without recognition has helped maintain stability, but also reinforces the status quo, making meaningful reconciliation more difficult to achieve until today. While functional coexistence prevents renewed conflict, it doesn't necessarily lead to deeper trust or shared future vision. Actually, this is the major problem that continues until today. The challenge for Cyprus moving forward is to expand intercommunal engagement beyond mere functionality, allowing more meaningful cooperation while addressing the underlying issues of recognition, identity, and historical grievances. functional coexistence in Cyprus is not static. Actually, Tatsushi mentioned this several times. Functional coexistence cases are not static. They're changing, they're dynamic, they're evolving. And but they're still shaped by both political constraints and the resilience of Cypriots who continue to find ways to engage despite these divisions. There are some key areas to explain how Cypriots navigate this reality, because you may ask, like, if it is still functional coexistence, it shouldn't be something very positive. How do they navigate this? Border crossings. Border crossings are not like the checkpoints that we have in Israel-Palestine case. Border crossings are like there are 9 and 2 more in at the military bases. So people can cross from north to south freely. As they can work in the south if they want to. They can go to the north if they wanted to have a dinner, meet their friends, or they can collaborate on projects. So it's they're really helping for free movement. But still, they still are limited, and they still haven't eliminated their existence, didn't eliminated the political and psychological barriers between the two communities. In terms of economic social interactions, despite political divisions, Cypriots from both sides engage in trade, employment, business partnerships. However, these relationships are often transactional rather than transformative, meaning they don't necessarily lead to greater trust. As I said, bi-communal activities are important. Various projects, including technical committees and grassroots peace building efforts and Track 2 initiatives, have fostered cooperation. Yet, as long as political recognition remains unresolved or the future of the comprehensive peace deal, these efforts struggle to create systemic change. So Cyprus, in this form, presents a unique case of enduring functional coexistence. And functional coexistence allowed Cypriots to live without direct violence, but it has not created conditions for lasting peace. And my chapter in the book actually argues that understanding and expanding functional coexistence rather than expecting immediate resolution may be the key to building more inclusive and collaborative future. Thank you so much for your time. I think I made the time, right? Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you, Tats, again for shepherding this. You kept me within structure, which I really appreciated. So I will be talking about transitioning to possibly functional coexistence approach in the case of Armenia and Turkey. And very quickly, for those of you don't know, the recent changes in the region from 2020 happened the Second Karabakh War, and then in 2023 there has been the exit of the Armenian population from Nagorno-Karabakh, which frames the regional dynamics, and we'll talk more about this when she presents her chapter. But this is important for understanding the context. So Armenia and Turkey are neighboring countries. However, for the past 30 years, there are no official diplomatic relations between Armenia and Turkey because of the Armenian genocide that Turkey does not recognize as a genocide, despite of recognition by other states. But with that being said, there has been attempts to develop a relationship, and what I'm trying to in this chapter to show, if you remember the kind of the rounds that Tats showed, the enduring state of nonviolence, but also mutual denial, and then functional coexistence exists in that kind of the overlap. I think what I'm trying to show is how those two bubbles exist, but they don't overlap in case of Armenia, Turkey, and how we can make them overlap and create that space where functional coexistence can function. So again, in 2007, there was a process that was started by Swiss mediation. In 2008, both presidents attended a soccer match in Armenia because it played out the way that Armenia and Turkey were placed in the same group for the qualifying of World Cup. That kind of kickstarted the normalization process. But the protocols of normalization were signed. However, after that, for several years, both countries' parliaments and legislative bodies were struggling to ratify them. And then eventually in 2015, the process was completely halted. And then after the Second Karabakh War in 2020, there was an opportunity open for normalization, what is called usually normalization round 2. And in this, here in this context, I want to show how functional coexistence potentially can apply or can emerge within the Armenia-Turkey context. There is a generational nature to the conflict. The conflict between Armenia and Turkey goes back to, again, 1915 with the Armenian genocide. They're largely, except for the genocide itself, and then in 2020, Turkey very actively was involved in supporting Azerbaijan in a military action. Aside of those two episodes, the relationship was pretty much non-violent in nature, no physical violence. But there is also, we see the other element of functional coexistence, Turkey's active denial of Armenian historic identity as victims of genocide and historical claims to the land. At the same time, Armenia, because of its size, obviously different sized countries, is engaged in passive non-recognition. Armenia formally, officially has not recognized the border between Armenia and Turkey, claiming that that border was drawn by the Sevres agreement, and because Armenia never denounced the agreement and accepts the agreement, there is no need for the second time of like officially recognizing the border, which creates a tension. But again, like there is power asymmetry between the two countries, but as the theory of functional coexistence suggests, it is not debilitating for either side. And each side kind of engages in type of denial that is more adept to the policies and the size of the country. What is important to understand when we were looking at the previous kind of the timeline of what happened when, within this context, we're looking at this as isolated episodes within the history, and what functional coexistence approach in case of Armenia, Turkey can offer us is this step, like stepping back and developing this historical awareness of shifting boundaries of acceptable conflict behavior. Things that were not, were thought being impossible at some point are materializing now, and we see that. And acknowledging them and thinking about them on a continuum can potentially provide a space where the enduring non-resolution and denial come together to create that space. And what we see here in 2009, the first time that Turkish and Armenian president attended the soccer match in Yerevan. Then in 2014, Erdogan made a statement about on the anniversary of the Armenian genocide. Yes, he did not call it a genocide, but he recognized the suffering of Armenian people in the Ottoman Empire. In 2019, Erdogan tweeted in Armenian, sharing condolences about the passing of the Armenian Patriarch of Constantinople. And 2021-22, there have been high-level official meetings and visits of the Armenian diplomats to Turkey and vice versa. And this breaks the established tradition of Armenian and Turkish diplomats meeting at the margins of other events internationally. So there were direct visits. That is a change of behavior. Another unfortunate disaster, the earthquake in 2023 that happened for the first time in 30 years. The land border between Armenia and Turkey was open for Armenia to deliver humanitarian aid to the victims. Again, something that did not, again, historic and unprecedented, and which was followed by the special envoy, Turkish envoy, tweeting thank you and acknowledging Armenia's kind of relief and humanitarian assistance to Turkey. So again, these are things happening within the past 2 decades, I guess if my math is right, that shows changes of behavior that previously was seen as that's impossible to achieve. And having this image and having this historic awareness that these things can change is very important for creating that space for functional coexistence. But also, as theory suggests, there are also evolving elastic boundaries that go beyond specific political actions. Because what we saw in the previous slide, those are the behaviors on the political high level. But we also see the changing of the boundaries of how the societies interact. We see a high civil society involvement in Turkey. In 2007, a prominent Armenian journalist, Turkish citizen, was murdered in the street, and then it started this public outrage campaign. People, hundreds and thousands of people in Istanbul marched the street, saying, "Well, Orhan Dink, we are all Armenians," which is again unprecedented from the civil society. In 2008, the kind of elite intelligentsia and elite in Istanbul and other parts of Turkey organized "I Apologize" campaign, recognizing the tragic events of 1915, which was another change in the behavior. As well as in Armenia, we see different types of changes. Again, from the perspective of like national identity built on the being the victims or the survivors of the genocide, we have seen emergence of alternative narratives about the Turkish citizens. And this particular organization, European Integration NGO, has collected and publicized stories of Armenians who were telling the stories how they were saved and kind of taken to a rescue by Turks as they were escaping genocide. A narrative that is not very popular or very much acknowledged in the Armenian kind of discourse. So again, changes are happening. So what are some of these implications? I guess we have we have two nations bordering no diplomatic relations, but at the same time, generations grew up without in this mutual denial and an enduring state of non-violence. So I think several important key elements to take out or to kind of draw from here is there is a need for developing this awareness of historically changing boundaries of acceptable conflict behavior. What is it possible today can be possible 3 years down the road. Stay constructively engaged in this state of non-resolution and push for and try to find ways of focusing on pragmatic steps. Some of the things that have been discussing was opening the border for the crossing of the third country passport holders of third countries. Another thing was how to register Armenian. There are a lot of seasonal migrants and illegal workers of Armenian nationality, how to provide them the residence permits or work permits in Turkey. So those are some of the things that are happening, or how to establish or register Turkish businesses in Armenia to do this trade work. And then again, direct trade, opening borders, some of those things that once we focus on them, there is a possibility of creating that overlap of the shared space where we can again move working on certain pragmatic issues that eventually can present that social change that potentially can lead to the resolution of the conflict. And again, as Tatsushi mentioned in his presentation about that we are not suggesting that we're not functional coexistence is not the ultimate goal. It is it's not meant to replace positive peace that we should be aspiring for, but at the same time, it is the attempt to find the pragmatism in the negative peace and find ways to create enabling conditions for long-term social change. And I feel that Armenia-Turkey context is very much ready for those shifts to happen, and it's about changing the perspective and finding this common ground. Thank you.
Yeah, you can use that.
Good afternoon. Glad to be here after a few years, and good to see Kevin, Chris, Luis, Dan, and everyone here as well. Thank you. It's always good to go back home in some ways. Thank you, Alp, for supporting the project and also this meeting as well, and Tats and Margarita for leading us to this stage of being able to share our thoughts. I guess I just saw that Tats just now put the Israel-Palestine in the third category where there's a bit more uncertainty. Here we're dealing, I think, with the case of Israel-Palestine, and maybe among the group, I'm the most skeptical about the functional coexistence approach in general in cases and have lots of questions about it. But I'm glad also to hear that Tat's presentation really identify the third out of the four principles in terms of the functional coexistence, not going to be a tool to justify apartheid or colonial and other arrangement that already clear exist in Israel-Palestine. I'm not going to talk about Gaza and the West Bank case. I'm going to talk about the Palestinians inside Israel, and those are 20% of the population of Israel. 20 years ago, when I worked with my mentors and supervisor, Chris and Kevin and Rich and others, and late Lawi, I did my dissertation on classic case of functional coexistence, and I did a study of examining peace building and dialogue in Israel between Arabs and Jews, where I was trying to promote the formula that this dialogue and conflict resolution field actually has the potential to evolve into something more transformative in the Arab-Jewish relations inside Israel. Unfortunately, this has shifted significantly, and now the Arab-Jewish relations in Israel exist in different domain, different area, mostly due to the probably what's happening also in this country and many other populist leaders or dictatorship where they push the entire system into a more polarized discourse and narrative. And that's, I think, what happened in Israel as well in Arab-Jewish relations. So I'm not sure we can today in Israel, inside Israel, describe the relation in any term of coexistence. I think what we have so far in the past 20 years, what evolved since 2000, Al-Aqsa Intifada, a higher and more intense level of mechanism of control. And I think we're moving towards more, if this government continue to be in power, toward more very clear segregation and apartheid system within Israel. And I think eventually that's what will be manifested later on. So I'm gonna go quickly on this small minority that I divided it into three phases. Up to 66, from 48 to 66, it was clear under military administration, no coexistence. One group has military rule over the other. By 67, Israel occupied the West Bank, and then they released this internal community and they made them citizen, equal citizen. Sorry, so they have this area between 1967, and I would say it lasted probably until mid-90s by Oslo and post-Oslo probably 2000, where there was a glimpse of hope that actually the Zionist project in Palestine might actually develop a form of equal rights, develop a form of a space for Arabs and Jews to live together, at least to explore a shared and common narrative. But I think that illusion or that dream in many ways collapsed with the second Intifada, as well as the entry of Netanyahu and the ultra-nationalist right wing that Kevin written about it in the early 80s. Took control of the government, and their narrative was narrative of exclusion. There was no common coexistence in that sense. This is a Jewish Zionist state, and anyone who will stay here will be a second-class citizen and subject to the Jewish Zionist domination of that area. So based on that, I say this period there was accommodationist or normalizing coexistence. They experiment in it. But I think right now we are, for the future, we'll be looking at transformative coexistence approach, which I feel more comfortable with it. So you can use settler colonialism, internal colonialism, or control by Ian Lustig. All of these are probably the one who used to explain Arab-Jewish relation inside Israel. And then some, those who support Israelization would use democratic theory, ethnic national democracy, to justify Jewish state actually can be democratic, and that already collapsed by the late 80s. Already collapsed. This group is 150,000 who remain, indigenous people remain in the land, and basically they grow up to be 20%, and they were in probably a couple of decades they found themselves from a agricultural community into basically cheap labor within the Israeli economy. They basically, the Israeli Zionist ideology at that time, Jewish Zionist ideology, divided them into Bedouin, Christian, Druze, Muslim, for them not to crystallize any national identity. And they introduced many curricula, many programs sponsored by the government to de-Arabize them, to de-Palestinize them, and make them more Israeli. And as I said, that really collapsed. There is at least 65 laws today by the Israeli parliament, by the Knesset, that discriminate between Arabs and Jews inside Israel, and those will increase with the Ben Gvir. Thank God he's out, but whoever left in this government, and I think whoever going to come later, they have really specific laws to make sure that there is no source of coexistence between Arabs and Jews in this state. The most three recent one are the Jewish nation state that even affected those who serve, Arabs who serve in the army, or Druze serve in the army. Also 2003, where spouses are prohibited from reunification family, that was in the law. If you marry somebody from the West Bank or Gaza or even outside, you cannot be reunified with them. And every family who ended up refugees in Lebanon, Syria, and all the Arab countries, all their properties were confiscated by the state of Israel, and that's the property law that basically get them out of control for that. It's a traumatic shift in terms of being indigenous minority and going into a under domination, and then you live for 20 years that you think you are going to be equal citizen, but then that also disappear because of the ideological shift within the dominant group, who decide, no, we cannot partner with them, we cannot trust them in that sense. So again, from 1980s, Palestinization was become more stronger, and the Palestinian minority in Israel faced difficult question regarding to be Israelized, or to how to deal with the Israelization policy. And I think a clear, at least 30% evolved to say we are going to be connected in terms of our destiny to the Palestinian, but there is also significant number of at least 30%, and this is debatable between many politicians and aspect, who basically accommodationist. They vote for the Zionist party, they serve in security forces, they participate in Jewish state ritual, and they embrace the Arab minority status in Jewish state. They accepted that. And even one of the Southern Islamic movement, he went into a government with with Bennett government a few years ago, which basically the first time in the history of the state where right-wing government accept the partnership with a Palestinian Muslim group. So the accommodation is still there, and they're about 30% of the population in my views. If I give 30% to them and 30% who reject any form of coexistence based on Jewish state, then we remain with 40% who are in the middle, and they're waiting basically, where to vote and where to go with their destiny and their partnership or their living together. Basically, the Israeli agency embracing and rejecting accommodationist, and that's what we deal with today. It's basically denial the indigenous right of that, and exclusivist in terms of their approach, which leaves no space really for cooperation and increases segregation in that aspect. Lots of activities. I'll just go to the war in Gaza. And there is another area, the development. This community have 220, 230 people killed every year by urban violence or urban crime, organized crime violence, supported, orchestrated sometimes, and definitely not dealt with by the Israeli security. They use this to continue and control any movement within the Palestinian inside Israel. And this is Arab on Arab violence, organized crime. It's classic. We live in DC, and black on black violence has been an instrument used to control black people in this country, and we always import in Israel. They always import what's very effective.
One of our major
things.
exports.
Absolutely, yeah. They import racism very nicely. And tomorrow, the meeting between the two leaders, Netanyahu and Trump, they will continue to coordinate that. I'll move faster here. The disaster of Gaza. Nothing going to be the same after Gaza, at least from the Palestinian descriptive and also from the Israeli descriptive, Israeli Jewish one, because there's a mental siege in Israeli public that is basically we can't live with them, and the discourse, we have to expel them. We have to either kill or expel. These are the only two solutions on the table right now. I mean, effectively, that's what's happening in Gaza. And that leaves very little room, as Tat said in his third principle, for any space of a mutual recognition or for any space of cooperation. So the industry of dialogue, the industry of conflict resolution did collapse. Tat, you mentioned that it might collapse, and it did collapse in a larger scale inside Israel, not West Bank and Gaza, but inside Israel. And many people are not necessarily participating in that. So we have, I'm not going to go through the numbers in Gaza, but Gaza effect on the Palestinian Israel. Remember, those people lived 75 years within Israeli Jewish government and the community. The result is that this government basically tried to encourage hate speech against Arabs inside Israel. Hundreds of arrests, termination of employment, expel people from university, cut 15% budget cuts, as opposed to 5% for the Jews that during the war, prohibiting any form of public protest. I went into Israel about 3 weeks ago. I was there, and the first thing I was told by my family and by my friend, no posting, no social media, we're not afraid for you. We just don't want to be affected by whatever association we have with you. So I refrained for 3 weeks from any Facebook stuff and social media until I left the country. I was in Athens. I posted my first frustration about the situation there. But this is a conditional citizenship. So I think we have moved, unfortunately, this may be one of the cases where they moved from some form of functional coexistence possibility in the 80s, early 90s, into more negative, more sort of the third type of functional coexistence that was described here. Rise of racism, and basically it's public now. You can actually call for the killing of Arabs and killing of Palestinian, and that's been normalized, and the dehumanization of any Palestinian is formalized in many ways by the government itself. The Zionist Israeli ideology fundamentally negates and rejects the full, equal civic and national rights of Palestinians, the current one in power for the past 20 years. What we're seeing is really Netanyahu penetrating the deep state of Israel and changing the fabric of the Ashkenazi majority who were pushing some kind of a liberal democracy under the Jewishness of the state. That dream has collapsed, and now the country is unfortunately run by a group of fascists, and not my term. This is Israeli analysts using the term fascism and war crime and genocide in Gaza. This is what they lead the country, and I think the implication of that on the Arabs in Israel or Palestinian Israel are very clear. The minimalist approach here for coexistence is expulsion, and that's what people are dealing with today. Then you have the accommodationists who now saying, let's wait, don't talk. They will leave the Trump equivalent, in my view. They will leave, the regime will change, a new centrist government will come in about 5-10 years, and then we can come back and work on the accommodationist. But then there is also a group who says, no, we should aim for the entire system change, no recognition of Jewish state, and come back to one citizen, one vote. This is a shared community, shared state for everyone in an equal way, and one vote, one person is what they propose, and that's the maximalist part. How do you move forward? Further policy of exclusion, return to liberal, these are the three options as mentioned them, return to the liberal Zionist government and agency, or Arabs and Jews claiming shared destiny in one state of all its citizens. Right now, the spaces shrank so significantly, you can't talk about dialogue or a crossing border as my two colleagues here presented in their two cases. I was 40 days there and I didn't see much of interaction between Arabs and Jews. You go to the mall, you see them, you see each other in the streets, but total separation, and very, very sort of suspicion. Although some people even work in the same offices, but the norm, as I was told, don't ever speak about the Palestinians in Gaza and don't post anything, don't speak about this topic. You're under a different regime. Just a couple of notes regarding 4 minutes, so 2-3 minutes about this. I'm not sure Tats and people who's gonna sort of work with the theory to what extent we are doing justice if we look at Law's old 1982 ethics of intervention about the justice, empowerment for our responsibility, the 3 values that underline our responsibility and intervention. I'm not sure that the whole model of mutual denial and us accepting it and coming with dialogue and conflict resolution, as opposed to coming in with what you mentioned, nonviolent action, boycott, civil disobedience, advocacy for human rights. And that's really pre-intervention prior to the conflict resolver come in to clean up the mess. So there's a bit of ethical issues here for me and for many other who oppose the notion of pragmatic, passive acceptance of the possibility of doing peace building and conflict resolution in a place like Gaza or the West Bank, or even in some ways during these days in Israel. Because if we put the $1 or $100 in that budget, in that area, it means we have less energy in the advocacy, in the nonviolence action, in the other area. And we're making a decision by supporting the status quo and that ideology that is in power. So it's really ethically, should we continue and work on this concept of constructive engagement under conflict resolution and peace building, or constructive engagement under nonviolent action resistance, including confronting the system that generated this aspect. And maybe where I am now, I feel that it's much better for me, at least, and some of my colleagues who work in this area, is to stick to the nonviolent resistance, to the confronting the system, reflecting its injustice, rather than appeasing through the dialogue and the conflict resolution methods that has to accept the mutual denial and domination of one group over the other reality where they live. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to see some familiar faces and to be here with you today. And I'll just echo all the kind words that have been said about Margarita and Tots and Susan and all the great work they've put into this. I wish I had a cheerier case to discuss to follow the previous spokesperson on the Arab-Israeli relationship within Israel. And I say, when I finished this chapter on Armenia and Azerbaijan some months ago, I actually expected there might be some significant changes between the writing that chapter and the publication of the book. A peace agreement was top of mind, precisely because the leaders of both conflict parties regularly presented a peace agreement as imminent. Well, a peace agreement remains elusive, and many of the obstacles identified in the chapter continue. And if anything, I regret to say, the climate between Yerevan and Baku has deteriorated in parallel, I see, with global trends in the international environment, the international landscape. Some of these have been mentioned, but I want to begin, and I don't have a PowerPoint, but I want to begin with a brief look at global trends, followed by an overview of the Armenian-Azerbaijan situation, and concluding with the potential for functional coexistence in this conflict. Military spending globally has increased exponentially in recent years, as the number of conflicts, new conflicts, and revived conflicts or resurgent conflicts have grown. Conflict parties reach now first and foremost to hard power, military and economic instruments to achieve their objectives and to settle scores, while soft power, diplomacy and track 2 initiatives become less effective. The spread of nationalist extremism frames conflicts as zero-sum contests. International institutions, laws, and norms are increasingly ignored. And I think a clear-eyed recognition of this is important for us to be effective in what we hope to contribute to. In this environment, glum as it is, adding functional coexistence options for engagement in conflicts is more valuable than ever, in my view, precisely because of its realistic assumptions and pared back ambitions in given situation. So turning to the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, after 2 wars and Baku's establishment of control over all of Karabakh in September of 2023, Armenia and Azerbaijan are less amenable to conflict resolution and reconciliation than before. There were numerous efforts to nudge the conflict parties in that direction. 26 years of track 1 and track 2 efforts to establish a durable peace between the First and Second Karabakh wars failed to prevent the return to war in 2020. The efforts were unable to mitigate or transform a classic security dilemma, which we need to bring back into the conversation, I think, at the heart of the conflict, which emerged in the late 1980s as the Soviet Union was unraveling. The security dilemma centered on contested territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, where 2 international principles enshrined in the UN Charter collided. Those principles, territorial integrity and self-determination. Azerbaijan's territorial integrity was a threat to Karabakh Armenians' self-determination and vice versa. And this is really the core of this, with many then ramifications from that. Existing and aspiring leaders in both newly independent states, Armenia and Azerbaijan, defaulted to nationalism to win public support in the new uncertainty and vacuum created when Soviet laws, norms, rules, and incentive structures disintegrated. And I underscore uncertainty, because whereas in Washington, people were celebrating, this is great for everybody. People who lived in these environments, the primary and dominating element was uncertainty. What now? What happens to our positions, our children, and everything else? Mobilizing populations along nationalist lines were bolstered by selective historical narratives, which emphasized enemy images, grievances, and competing victimhoods. These narratives were further entrenched after the First Karabakh War, when, due to ethnic cleansing, Armenians and Azerbaijanis really had little to no contact with each other. Gone were the stories of living together as neighbors, friends, cultural similarities, shared historical experiences. Of course, there were conflicts, but in this mosaic population, which composed the Caucasus for centuries. One might think that the most contentious issue was settled when Azerbaijan established control over Karabakh, but that is not the case. Armenia is rebuilding its military capabilities with the help of France and India the US to a lesser degree. Yerevan, of course, sees this as defensive. Understandably, it was defeated in the 2020 war, but it looks very different if you're sitting in Baku. The military buildup is seen as preparation to reclaim Karabakh by force. And the 100,000 Karabakh Armenians who fled Karabakh in the September of 2023 are seen as active and enthusiastic supporters of such an initiative. So Azerbaijan sees this in a very different way. Therefore, Baku demands that Armenia amend its constitution to eliminate all claims to Karabakh as a prerequisite for a peace agreement, not easy to do. And Baku has also renewed its demands for the southern corridor, the so-called Zangezur corridor, with extraterritorial governance, something that Yerevan rejects. To further complicate the landscape, and this conflict does not exist in isolation, regional and international actors compete for influence in the region and have since the implosion of the Soviet Union. And I will just list some of them because I could go on about this. Russia, of course, remains extremely important despite the recent contentious issues with both Armenia and Azerbaijan. Iran has long been a really important supporter of Armenian territorial integrity and has important political and economic ties with Armenia. But Iran, of course, is now weakened because of the developments in the Middle East. The US has, let's put it kindly, adversarial relations with both Russia and Iran, which complicates the landscape for Armenia. Turkey has close, multi-level and multifaceted relations with Azerbaijan, which most are familiar with, and they have long historical ties, cultural, and so on and so forth, as well as economic and security ties. But Armenia and Azerbaijan have parted company over relations with Israel. Israel is also a factor, and it is often overlooked in this equation. Israel has been a major supplier of advanced military weaponry to Azerbaijan since 2016, at least, which was critical in the 2020 victory. And in exchange, Baku provides Israel with energy supplies and a listening post and a potential launching pad for military action against Iran. In this environment, and I could go on, but I won't, this is an environment of conflicting and overlapping interests that increase the risk of miscalculation. What's going on, which is a very important source of concern. The risk of renewed conflict, I'd hate to say, is real. The relative weakness of Armenia and its lack of a credible external military support actor may tempt Baku to use military force to take control of this southern route that would link Azerbaijan directly with Nakhchivan through southern Armenia, which I mentioned before. And escalation of rhetoric has also been present. Baku talks about Western Azerbaijan, which is Armenia, and Yerevan's fascist government, which needs to be replaced. And despite this, or perhaps because of this, I would say, very bleak picture, and given the record of track 1 and track 2 efforts in the interwar period, functional coexistence offers a welcome and realistic alternative to engage in the region. So what elements of functional coexistence exist today? Well, first, let me highlight the biggest obstacle, and that is the absence of a negative peace. That has yet to be established. However, both parties retain agency, which is critical, despite a significant power asymmetry to the advantage of Azerbaijan. And the potential to create minimally livable social spaces could begin by reactivating the confidence building measures that both Prime Minister Pashinyan and President Aliyev agreed to in 2018 and 2019, followed by the implementation of the terms of the 2020 truce agreement, which was brokered by Russia. Caution is needed, however, in the win-win assumptions about opening regional communication, transit, and economic ties. And that's something we can come back to, because this is a very double-edged sword in very practical terms. Well, in conclusion, I would say the headwinds facing peace builders are quite strong. And in this environment, however, functional coexistence is a much needed addition to the peace builders' repertoire. In the Armenia-Azerbaijan case, working toward functional coexistence is a worthy objective. We're not where the Israelis and the Arabs were in Palestine, where they had periods of accommodation and then regression and so on. Working toward a functional coexistence is a worthy objective. Establishing a durable negative peace would mark a huge improvement for the affected populations for the foreseeable future. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you.